this lecture will become a part of an ebook, an open source ebook, which will um, be a compilation of all of the guest lectures we had in our course. That's a contribution we want to make to not only the academic community, but other communities that might benefit from this information. And without any more to say, I leave you with Dr. Diana Hernandez.
All right, happy to be here. Thanking, of course, you, Cecilio and Manda, for always being so generous and not just your scholarship, but in your friendship. And I'm really happy that we're part of this kind of network and this movement. I also want to shout out Talia, who is a fellow New Yorker and is my liaison I don't know. I don't know the official title. Cecilia, I'm unable to share my screen as yet, but as I get the permissions to do so, I just wanted to say that today I'll be giving a lecture about energy poverty, health, and climate change. And those connections may seem somewhat, or the kind of topics may seem disparate, but there's definitely a thread in all of this. A big part of my own work has largely been around humanizing household energy and kind of talking about this more technical issue on human terms, and also in terms of equity and the need to be inclusive, not just as we think about the future of energy, but also the kind of current status of it. I'm still unable to share my screen. It says host disabled, attendee screen sharing. So maybe if you make me a co-host, I'll be able to do it. So if you go to the participant list and make me a co-host, that should work. And just to give some context, today I'll be talking about different terms and the foundational aspects of energy insecurity, which has been a significant aspect of my academic work. Here we go. Thank you.
Sorry for that. Dinosaur here on the other
side. That's all right. No, listen, we're all kind of finding our way and we all must be a little patient. So this was my kind of opening slide, but what are the kind of foundational kind of aspects of energy insecurity? Why is it kind of a viable term and phrase for capturing that nexus of energy poverty, especially in the context of climate change? How do we understand the social patterns of energy insecurity, housing issues, AC access, heat, and disconnections? And then what are the kind of intersections around race, place, gender, and class? Let's think about we'll think about health impacts of energy insecurity, and then we'll kind of hear voices from the front lines. Again, in an effort to kind of elevate the human aspect of this, I always like to insert folks that are kind of directly impacted and tell a certain truth that some of us may be familiar with and resonate with us personally, but it's also kind of an obligation to really better understand these issues. So energy is essential to meeting our basic needs. And we know that not just in the context of COVID, where so many of us are stuck at home and needing access to electricity sources and potentially gas sources for heating and cooling, for cooking, lighting, refrigeration, etc., durable medical equipment as well. But also in the context of power outages, I'm thinking a lot about folks in California right now who are experiencing preventive shutoffs, right? So these safety shutoffs, dealing very much with the kind of context of wildfires and all of the kind of ambient air quality issues that are stemming from this climate related occurrence. And at the same time, I'm thinking about folks in the Gulf Coast region that are now also facing flooding from hurricanes. And one of the kind of most direct impacts that come from hurricanes are power outages. So as we think about energy, it's not just like on our kind of everyday trajectories around turning on the light and turning it off at night, whatever, but it's also about in the context of its absence, we sometimes recognize the kind of importance of a good like household energy and electricity in particular. I have placed Maslow's hierarchy of needs here on the right side. And just again, to drive home the idea that it is so fundamental and constitutes a basic need, energy really sits between a physiological need and a safety need. But really is kind of a base concern for humans and for human health and existence. So energy insecurity is kind of multidimensional, and it's multidimensional on purpose. So some of you may be familiar with other terms like energy burden, for instance, which is a ratio of energy cost to household income. So, you know, if a household allocates 6% or less to household energy, they're considered to be moderately energy burdens. But if they allocate 10% or more of their household income to energy, they would be considered severely energy burdened. So there's certainly this kind of issue of scale and severity that's there, but it's also limited, right? So something like energy burden doesn't fully appreciate people that live in public housing, for instance, who don't pay a utility bill, but may still have other physical aspects of their homes that are energy related. So for instance, outdated electrical panels, or insufficient insulation in homes that are very much on the physical dimension, but not fully captured by the economics. And it also doesn't fully appreciate the behavioral aspects, like what do people do in the context of hardship? And that's sometimes a physical hardship, or it's an economic hardship, or both. But it's certainly the fact that people are expressing agency and they are coping very actively in the realm of household energy. And those are the three dimensions of energy insecurity: economic, physical, and coping. So this really comes from, I mean, many of us have been in this space for a while, but I've been doing work on energy issues for the better part of the past decade, actually a little bit more. This comes from a project that I did for my dissertation, where I was going to people's homes and realizing that some of them just had like these like kind of very interesting setups, not having lighting in their bathrooms, for instance, and then running electrical cords from their bedrooms to the bathroom, you know, and like just a bunch of different hardships. Also, the recognition that finances were a big part, that arrearages, for instance, were a huge issue, that there were seasonal variations depending on cold weather and warm weather circumstances, that this was really about engendering priorities and trade-offs in households. So between food and medicine and the utility bills, or transportation and housing and the utility bills. So really kind of this juggling of the real basics. And also the idea of a harsh consequence in utility disconnections as a result of non-payment. So that's where kind of the intersection of poverty and energy is kind of most pronounced, is in this economic hardship. And I won't read all of these quotes, but just to give you a kind of a flavor for, you know, how this kind of came about. I'll just read some. So my electric bill has gone way out of whack. I mean, I have a $700 electric bill. Like, just by show of hands, how many of you could afford a $700 electric bill, like, per month? Nobody, like not even me. Like, this is just, it's so impossible. And yet this is the kind of hardship that, you know, many households are actually living with on a regular basis. Also, to kind of really demonstrate that trade-off, it's either pay the electricity bill or do what I got to do for my kids. And to be honest with you, I'd rather just turn all this stuff off, right? So this idea that at the end of the day, it's really about you know, taking care and having those parental responsibilities be at the forefront. You know, there's also this kind of billing issue and a lack of literacy around how to understand bills, but also the kind of fee structure that seems really to be so burdensome for people that are managing almost every dollar that comes into their home. So this is just kind of a flavor for some of the aspects of economic energy insecurity. Then there's also the question of physical energy insecurity. So this is a building on the left-hand side. It's a public housing building here in New York City, burning dirty fuels, but very much coming from the boiler in the building. And then this actually happens to be an old boiler of mine in my home, and it was clear, like, you know, it had to be replaced. Like at that point, it had reached its kind of end. But in reaching that end, I was fortunate enough to be able to replace it. But there are many, many households that kind of reach a similar endpoint, but aren't able to find the finances to ultimately make the necessary upgrades. So there again, this is really about building infrastructure, older homes, for instance, and also changes in energy systems and how that might come about. So to kind of drive the whole issue of how poor overall housing quality, one participant said there's no insulation in the house. That's why it's so cold, and the heating's always gone. The electric is outdated, and so is the plumbing. And another participant said, I want Boston Gas to come out here so that they can look at the boiler for themselves. Because the first inspector, when I first got my energy report, he told me it looked like I was heating the whole of Boston. Then I got to the next inspector's report, and his report is just as bad as the first man's report. What don't they understand? Don't go after me. Go after the landlord, because I can only afford to give you about $200 a month, and that's all I can give you, right? So there's also this sense of like ownership and who's responsible for a high bill, etc. All having to do essentially with these physical and energy infrastructure issues. And then there's the coping piece, right? So there's the active conservation. I always kind of give credit where it's due in terms of really appreciating just how much people are saving, right? So often we think about those that are impoverished as almost being kind of passive in their energy consumption, and that is so far away from the truth. And so, you know, it's also giving credit and appreciating those conservation methods, even if they might present health risks. So they might come with some adverse consequences as a result. Also the ideas and the strategies around seeking thermal comfort, having to negotiate how to pay bills, including leveraging earned income tax credits or other lump sums that are given and then redistributed right back to the utility companies, seeking fuel assistance, leveraging medical vulnerabilities for shutoff protections, reaching into those resilience resources, and then also relying on faith, hope, and despair. And these are, again, you know, some examples. I use my gas wisely. The only time it's on is to cook real quick, or hot water for showers. Right before it's time for the kids to take showers, I turn the heat on. And when they get ready for bed, sometimes I'll turn it down or I'll turn it off because they're underneath the blankets, meaning the heat. You just got to manage how you do it. If you don't need it, you shut it off. And then, you know, kind of thinking about how to manage doctor's visits and medical conditions that might even stem from energy insecurity to begin with, but that end up being a protection for shutoff. So I had my son's doctor fax a letter to the utility company saying that they can't shut off my lights because he's on an asthma machine and he needs it. So that's the only reason why my lights stayed on. So really an example of what people are doing in the context of this kind of hardship. And then these are examples of some adverse consequences that stem from energy insecurity. So environmental consequences, health consequences, and social consequences. And this again lays out what those look like. So hazardous exposures, heat and cold stress on the environmental side. Also in terms of chronic stress, one of the things that we're seeing in the global pandemic right now is a disproportionality of impact for communities of color, even across the economic spectrum. And what does that mean? Where does that stem from? It stems from these kind of chronic, toxic, everyday stressors that make it very difficult for people to lead healthy lives. Not to say that it's all about energy insecurity, far away from it, but it is to say that there are many contributing factors to this. And then also the idea of family disruption and stigma and residential instability, and also the downward spiral that comes from an inability to pay bills and then an inability to actually stay in home. So that evictions, for instance, are also a consequence of energy insecurity. Now let's talk about race, place, class, gender, and intersectionality. Like, well, how is this socially patterned? And here I turn to data from, or graphs from the US Energy Information Administration, which using 2015 data, for the first time ever, basically provided a metric for understanding the prevalence of energy insecurity in the United States. So 1 in 3, 37 million households are energy insecure in the United States. By comparison, about 17 to 18 million households are food insecure. And if you further compare those two concepts, we know that there is a lot of attention that is given to food insecurity, far less to energy insecurity. And what we also see is that if you kind of follow these blue bars, there are these kind of dimensions of energy insecurity that are highlighted by the Energy Information Administration, and that's the trade-offs that I discussed before, but also the receipt of a disconnection notice and also keeping homes at an unhealthy temperature. So some of these concepts may already sound familiar, but what you'll see is that in the dark blue bar, this is something that's happening almost every month. And in the lighter blue bars, it's something that's happening kind of less frequently, but still throughout the year, right? So thinking about that, it's really difficult for some households to actually even escape the idea of a trade-off is the real takeaway from this particular graph. Now, the other kind of aspect of this is just the fact that it's unequally distributed in society, so that low-income households, households with children, those living in older homes, and Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately impacted by energy insecurity at the national level. This is not so evident among the elderly, but I think that has a little bit to do with the fact that there are some more resources and protections for the elderly, but also that their relationship to energy might be marked by an earlier energy transition and potentially like a hyper conservation that may or may not actually be detrimental to their health. So we see this over and over again during heat waves, for instance, that the most susceptible population, not just by virtue of their vulnerable health status, but also the fact that many of them don't have running ACs, for instance, as a factor. So we know a lot about energy insecurity at this point, and I'm just going to run through this really quickly. We know that it affects 37 million households. We know that low income is a main driver. We know that persistent disparities by race and ethnicity and also immigration status exist, that children, seniors, and the medically vulnerable are at greatest risk, that renters and owners are differently burdened, that energy inefficiencies contribute to higher costs and decreased comfort and also adverse health outcomes, that there are geographic and spatial disparities at the regional and metro level, that it involves these complex coping strategies, that there are adverse consequences that stem from it, that health is both a predictor and an outcome, as I just kind of demonstrated with the heat wave example, that this concept is also motivating advocacy to advance energy justice. And I'll point to like the very recent Disconnection Reform Act in California, which used this concept as a way to really leverage the decrease of disconnections happening in the state of California. Housing conditions obviously are a big part of this. We know that lower income households are more likely to live in housing with heating and electrical equipment breakdowns, having experienced multiple heating equipment breakdowns, having experienced an interruption in utility service, inadequate insulation and insufficient heating capacity, and also report being uncomfortably cold for 24 hours or more. But what does that look like, in place? And this is a map from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And what you see is that the areas, so just to give you an orientation, this is Manhattan, this is kind of lower Manhattan, this is Central Park, upper Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. And what's really obvious is that people that live in kind of traditionally red line communities, communities of color, low income communities in upper Manhattan, the Bronx, and parts of Brooklyn are least able to access healthy housing, right? So housing that is free of maintenance defects. Likewise, thinking about heating complaints, which may or may not have to do with housing quality, you see that there's this kind of pattern around the Bronx, for instance, having significant amount of no heat complaints consistently over the years. And I'm going to skip over this slide, but also talking about air conditioning, right? So the opportunity to cool air, same thing. You see that in those same parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx, and some of the lower income areas and other places, there's also a kind of a less penetration rate, AC penetration rate in these areas. But if you're living in wealthier parts of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, then that isn't really as much of an issue, right? You have an almost perfect penetration rate of air conditioning. Over the summer, actually, they had issued as part of the COVID heat wave plan an intervention to provide 74,000 air conditioning units to low-income New Yorkers and those living in public housing. Only 1 in 2 households that live in public housing actually have a cooling source in their home. Now, also thinking about energy at the community level, energy insecurity at the community level, we did a project in Washington Heights. So that's that kind of strip. Let me just go back to so it's right up in here, adjacent to Harlem. This is East Harlem, West Harlem, Central Harlem. This is Washington Heights and Inwood, and this is the Bronx. So that's where our school is. It's also something that every hospital is mandated to do periodic kind of neighborhood community needs assessment, community health needs assessment. And so this was a part of it. And we asked this question of a representative sample of residents in the Washington Heights area. This is a 4-part energy insecurity indicator, asking whether or not they've received a disconnection letter or notice, if they had issues using a cook stove for heat, or that their place was not properly heated for 24 hours or more, and then also if they had received a shutoff. And what we found is that households with children, African American and Latino households, households with less than a high school education, lower income households were all more likely to be severely and moderately energy insecure. But very interestingly, and kind of thinking about the role of food-related aid, we found that households that had both access to SNAP and WIC were much more likely to be energy secure. So 81% of those households were energy secure, which is really hopeful. And also we've seen that in the inverse, so that households that have access to energy bill assistance are more likely to be food secure, really showing that kind of connection between heating and eating. And there's also a connection between gentrification and energy insecurity, so that tenants that are kind of new to the area were less likely to be energy insecure than those that had moved in 20 years prior. And also renters and those living in housing with poor conditions. The other thing that we found that I thought was interesting was the connection to health. And we found that energy insecure was significantly associated with pneumonia, with depressive disorder, with poor sleep quality, but not with diabetes and hypertension, which we realize is, that makes sense because diabetes and hypertension are more lifestyle oriented, whereas these other health conditions are, related to stress, for instance, or potentially to other kind of factors that might be in the housing setting. So thinking about the connection between all of these things and health, and also the context of climate change, this was, I believe, the paper that was given as background. So there's this kind of chronic energy insecurity, acute energy insecurity, these different factors that determine that distinction between chronic and acute, these kind of mediators, so heightened use and dependence, low income generation, right? So like a lot of times socio-demographic factors end up repeating and like these kind of cycles of poverty. And that we see difficulty navigating utilities and assistance programs, energy inefficiencies, power outages, a lack of modern energy services, and also service interruptions, and how those essentially have these direct secondary and tertiary outcomes that we see as kind of important for understanding the pathways by which energy insecurity ultimately impacts these various health conditions. So this work is really kind of opening up the possibility that that energy insecurity is influenced by climate change, are essentially manifesting themselves in poor health outcomes and also higher mortality for the most vulnerable. And so I'll end with some excerpts from an ongoing project. I'm in the process of writing a book at this point called Powerless, The People Struggle in America. And it's based on 100 interviews that I did all around the United States, in Montana, California, Arizona, Texas, Memphis, Alabama, New York, Pennsylvania, and Puerto Rico, as well as Detroit. And essentially, it was an opportunity to kind of understand the front lines of this experience. And in so doing, I am, essentially capturing what people have experienced. And this is the story of Rosalina, who's a 76-year-old homeowner. She's been living in a neighborhood adjacent to Little Italy in the Bronx. Her income source is from Social Security. And her utilities are oil and electricity, and they come to over $5,000 a year, but her annual income is less than half of the poverty line for a single person. So she's at $900 a month. And what she said is like, my God, I gotta pay the bills. And I really think about it. She had lost sleep about it. She manages a cold house. And she says, my house is cold and I just can't afford it. Her daughter was also part of the interview, and she's like, in the past, when she wasn't healthy, medical expenses superseded energy bills. But this year, because she has good health, the energy superseded the medical bills because she's healthy. Otherwise, health would be the priority. But Rosalina really said it best, and she said it in the most succinct way. She's like, Diana, I have 2 words for you. I suffer. And that was really her way of kind of summarizing and kind of putting this accentuation on the realities of her life when it comes to energy, and it was really marked by suffering. And there's a gentleman named Patrick. He's also a New Yorker. He's a renter. He had just moved into his first studio apartment. He's in his early 30s. And he's managing the housing expenses and the utilities and all of his other bills, but on sporadic income. So his wages would change because of fluctuating hours. He would sometimes lose his job, get another job, but there was also a lot of like kind of labor market variation and volatility for him personally. And one of the, I showed the examples of the no heat complaints. And so he would have absolutely been in that box because, he says he has to put on the oven at night because of the heat. The building controls the heat, meaning like the landlord. And the heat comes on only a little bit. It's almost like you don't feel anything. It's like freezing cold, and I have to turn on my oven, even though I know the oven is not a good thing to turn on. I turn it on at night, like every night, and that's why my bill is so high. So someone like him actually doesn't even qualify for LIHEAP, which is the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, because in New York City, it's only issued to people that pay their own heating bills. But technically, his heat is included in the rent, except it doesn't factor in the fact that he's supplementing the heat but with his oven. And not only is he supplementing the heat, it's also kind of coming at the expense of his health, because he says, when I get up, I feel nauseous. I know they say carbon monoxide. When I wake up, I feel like I'm suffocating. Then I shut it off and deal with the cold for another 4 hours or so. And he talked about it in the context of not just the physical hardship of this, but also the kind of mental health issues. And he says, I just be depressed after a while. Oh boy, here we go again, another turn off notice. I get a little down or depressed, anxious to see how I'm going to pay it. So really kind of confirming a lot of what was stated up above about the links. And then I also met a woman married, 27 years old, with 2 children. She's a renter in a small multifamily building. Her and her husband do work, but they don't earn enough to cover the $1,800 rent for their 2-bedroom apartment. So her and her husband and the 2 kids stay in one room, and then they rent out the other room to someone in the community. And it's the way that they kind of are able to manage their housing expenses, and then they split the utility bills. But the utility bills come pretty high because they don't have a secure heating source. So their gas and electricity bills combined come to set about $400 a month. And she says, oh my God, this sounds so bad, as we were kind of going over the various kind of housing questions. She says, besides the rent, the energy bill is one of the highest bills that I have to pay. Electricity wise, everything needs to be replaced. The power jumps, and that's a hazard. The outlets are burning, and that can cause a fire. So she's, kind of making sense of all of the hazards, but also the high cost of these hazards in her own life. So as we kind of think about concluding, what I want us to kind of think about is not just this energy poverty, health, climate change connection, as we simply kind of think about renewables and this kind of bright energy future, but also thinking about how it is that people are kind of managing hardship right now, and what this ultimately means for climate change as we experience it these days, but also how we kind of plan our programs and policies to incorporate these perspectives and these needs moving forward. And so with that, I'll stop and entertain questions for the next 20 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that great presentation. Um, let's open the floor then for questions. Please feel free to jump in, identify yourself. I know that I recognize faces from all the way from Arizona to Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. So this is looking good. Please feel free to jump in.
I had a question because you were mentioning that there's like a association between food security and energy security, and I was wondering, I can see there's a lot of like similar factors that would lead people to be insecure in both areas, but I was wondering if you could like explain a little bit more how those are connected.
Great question. In our Washington Heights study, we found that it was basically 1 in 2 households that were food insecure were also energy insecure. And that's not the only metric. I mean, this whole tension between heating and eating is reflective of the trade-offs that people are making in order to make ends meet. So they might eat a little less during winter months. In fact, in Europe, they have much more advanced empirical work in this space, and they found that there was a 10% caloric decrease during winter months as people, essentially were needing to then accommodate their heating costs. So people were eating 10% less calories essentially during this time. But it has everything to do with the fact that, there's this constant juggling act. What I have found in the United States is that during the seasonal moratoriums that exist, so right now, and I mean, the moratoriums around utility shutoffs are variable throughout the United States, even in the context of a pandemic where we're all really reliant on these services. But what we do know is that during the seasonal moratoriums, people are able to eat better, they're able to better manage their household expenses. But then just like what's happening right now, there's no bill forgiveness in that time. And so come spring, especially in winter, like in colder states, then people are now obligated to pay these big bills. And that's when those tensions are most clear. The other piece to this is also a policy issue. So the way that LIHEAP, the bill assistance program for home energy is distributed is a one-time payment. So it's given as kind of a lump sum, $1,000, for instance, depending on where you are and your income eligibility, to the utility company. So it goes directly to the utility company. What happens with food assistance is that it's distributed monthly. And that is another piece of the tension that almost like doesn't allow people to manage their utility bills well, because the way that the assistance is distributed is just that one-time annual payment, and that's it.
I wanted to add something, if I may, from as we remember Hurricane Maria and the impact it had on the electric system, trying to make a connection also with the way the storm entered through a particular way, the southeast side of the island. That side of the island was already historically well known, but actually it's called the hunger route because it's a well recognized food desert in terms of availability of food outlets and access to food, and that that really played a role in the recovery stages of the hurricane. Mm-hmm. We know that some people were without electricity for 329 days after the hurricane hit, and so sometimes people, their dietary needs, their dietary behaviors changed drastically, and that had an impact in the death, the mortality rate, of people that now we know, after a lot of ignorance manufacturing, that got up to almost 3,000 deaths. And people, for example, eating out of a can, high sodium type of diet had a nefarious impact on people with pre-existing conditions, and that those sorts of connections, in terms of policy, are not necessarily made, and in terms of emergency response, it calls to a more educated design and a more educated emergency management protocols and a paradigm that includes people from public health, that includes people from not just the health sciences in general that are not necessarily who you looked at when you put an emergency management plan together, which is mostly civil engineers and looking at the structural issue of things. I just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important. As you were saying that, I also wanted to mention that one of the kind of, again, most direct impacts of power outages is food spoilage. So one of
Yes.
the things that we've seen again and again is that people are like, listen, it was so difficult for me to acquire this food to begin with. Within 12 hours, right, when the refrigerator is no longer functioning, there are significant food losses. And for households that could barely afford it to begin with, it's very problematic. So that's another kind of intersection with food that's connected in many ways to what Cecilio was saying. I mean, he was talking about a longer term issue because obviously the power outage in Puerto Rico was, an inordinate amount of time, and the kind of the impact of it was so universal and ubiquitous around the island. But just thinking about intermittent power outages, like that is something that comes up a lot for people.
Absolutely. Any more questions, please? Not everybody at the same time.
Finn.
Yeah, if I may. So what distinguishes energy insecurity from the other forms of insecurity that people in various vulnerable groups undergo? Like, why is it different from, say, food insecurity or water insecurity or housing insecurity?
Well, I mean, in the same ways that we appreciate that there are those other kinds of insecurity, it is to appreciate the fact that utility bills, for instance, come and they're not necessarily factored completely into water or housing, right? But that they are really self-standing. So it is to say that as we think about poverty, so there was a time when poverty was just understood to be a question of household income. And then like the social scientists and the policy researchers and things, they started to think about this and say, no, actually, this is about material hardships. And material hardships are about people being able to meet their basic needs. That kind of connects a little bit again to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, the established material hardships are three. Like there's a lot of consistency in the appreciation for housing as a material hardship, food as a material hardship, and healthcare, access to like medical services as material hardships. But as we think about modernizing and what we need today, especially in a place where infrastructure is not the issue, right? As we think about the developing world, there's energy access issues, what they call energy poverty, which has everything to do with whether or not people are even connected to a grid. In the United States and other kind of industrialized countries, that is not the issue. The issue is whether or not people can afford their utilities, but also as their what kind of quality issues they might be experiencing. And as I explained before, one of the kind of distinguishing factors of energy insecurity is that it factors in not just the economics, but also whether or not the physical conditions of housing are adequate when it comes to the energy infrastructure and installation. But that's a great question, right? I mean, I was just on a panel for Brookings in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and it was all about utility affordability. And in that bucket, they included energy, which is a kind of sector that I was representing, but also broadband and water, right? And now all of a sudden, broadband is being included in telecommunications into this mix of things that we hadn't necessarily been thinking about as an insecurity in the past, but that all of a sudden has become that much more pressing given the pandemic. Just an example of how things evolve.
And it's a good one.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question, Finn.
I just wanted to mention today, I just got a piece of information that blew my mind from the folks at the Colorado College of Mines, their public policy center. They did a study that finds that about 3.5 billion people have inadequate access to energy in the world. I mean, that number is just baffling. And of course, the variations in terms of wealth, income, race, gender. It'd be interesting to look at those numbers and how they're distributed around the world. But this is a serious issue. Like something like internet access, that's completely correlated to energy availability. Is now being touted by the Washington Post as the one of the highest reasons why students are dropping out of college, and the net of repercussions continues to make itself more and more dense. So it is through dialogues like this, I think it helps sensitize us and really make us, gives us a better sociological imagination of how to make those connections through energy.
I also wanted to thank you, Cecilia. I think that's such an important point, but I wanted also to kind of mention an example of Detroit. So, in Detroit, there a lot of people, for instance, own their homes outright, and
Yes.
These are family homes and these kinds of things. But many of those homes they haven't been upgraded, like in a very long time. Like the energy systems in the homes haven't been upgraded in a very long time. Neither has there been kind of like they haven't necessarily like insulated, weatherized, etc. So one of the factors that is now creating a pathway to homeowners losing their homes is that their energy bills are so high. And their energy bills basically preclude them from making, like paying their other bills, including their property taxes. So there's this major issue around property tax foreclosures in Detroit around properties that are already paid for because they can't keep up with the property taxes, in part and mostly because their energy bills are so high. So this is like, in some ways about creating a nomenclature and a way of like understanding a problem that exists in its different kind of manifestations in different places, but certainly one that is totally addressable. Like if we make energy bills more affordable, either because we're setting rates in an affordable way and there's variability and that kind of thing, right? It certainly kind of opens up the possibility for problem solving because now we're just starting to segment the issues, according to this basket of necessities we'll keep it at that. Corey?
What are your thoughts about more localized energy systems like community or rooftop solar?
So I've seen that work differently in different places. I'll tell you one that's inspiring me right now. So Washington, D.C. has a program called Solar for All. It's run by the Department of Energy and Environment. It's a municipal agency, and they have this kind of two-pronged way of getting people that are non-traditionally, in the renewable energy space to be a part of it. So one is that they own this kind of community solar farm. And what they do is that whatever energy is generated, they're able to provide credits to subscribers of their, the community solar project. And the credits usually come to something like $500 for the year. And that's a really good supplement to those that are able to, for instance, get LIHEAP energy bill assistance. In total, they're able to get through these different programs like utility discount programs around the fee structure on the bills, but also the LIHEAP benefits. They're able to get households that are otherwise like extremely energy burdened to be at a 3% energy burden for their households. Like that is like superb. But a lot of it is leveraging this idea of, community solar projects. The other way in which the Solar for All program works is that they have low-income homeowners kind of qualify. They have a heavily subsidized solar program for homeowners. But in addition to the solar piece, they also do the kind of weatherization upgrades and like the roof repairs and that kind of stuff to kind of ready the homes. So in addition to actually like helping low-income homeowners stay in their homes, better afford their utilities, they're also able to get the physical upgrades that are necessary for them to like live more comfortably in their homes and reduce their cost overall. So it's like a really good example of how this could work. It's not the only one, but it's one of the ones that I feel like, wow, that's like a very comprehensive way of dealing with this. And to me, it's that kind of high touch, thinking about this from all different sides approach that we kind of need. Like, I don't think that we could continue to do this, like, heavily parsed out approach. We lose a lot when we do it this way. So that's kind of an example of one that you might look into, but it's a good one.
Awesome.
Other
Awesome.
questions?
Actually, yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Talia.
I have a question about, you mentioned briefly bill literacy, and I'm wondering also, like for example, I think his name was Patrick, that one guy who was using his oven to supplement his heat. Technically, that's illegal, right? For a landlord to include heat in the bill and then not give you heat. And I know my dad was like also living in an apartment where the same thing was happening, like a little bit of heat was coming out and yet he was paying for heat. And so in the fine print, right, like on paper, there are technically legal resources you can use and you can hire a lawyer and sue and you would, I guess, probably win. But like, I guess this isn't a question, but can you speak a little bit to how, because of this lack of maybe legal resources or other, like just legal knowledge or reading the fine print and not being, I guess, I don't love the word like literate, but not exactly knowing what it is that you're owed when you pay, how does that adversely affect like people who are already disadvantaged?
So first of all, great question. And I just want to say that you're asking two different things, actually. So on the one hand, it's like, when the bill comes, are you able to understand the fees and, are there ways that like some of those fees might be eliminated, that kind of thing. That's one issue. What you're talking about though is also about the violation of housing codes, existing housing codes. And for that, like actually that's how I got into this work, was through working with lawyers that were helping connect medical patients addressing like the source problems of their health issues. And so much of this was about housing advocacy. So one example in New York City is an organization called Heat Seek. And what they do is that they help residents in buildings with heat complaints to track, because you have to be able to track this. The municipal agency that oversees and enforces heat complaints will not accept a complaint as legitimate unless it's filled out in a very specific way. So HeatSeek actually does this remotely. It's like a civic tech organization, and they help to like populate by providing these heat sensors in the homes, the actual form, deliver it to the agency, to the enforcement agency, and then actually have a no heat complaint that's attached to that particular building. But it has been like these kind of innovations, programmatic interventions that allow for, and that was then endorsed by the city council. Anybody who calls the 311 line here will end up having access to this service, and then they could go through the whole process, right? So that really then holds the landlords accountable to actually providing heat. So they have two different things. I think the utility companies in some ways, like we demonize landlords, and landlords ought to be demonized when they're not doing things like providing heat. But we haven't done enough to like really pay attention to what the utility companies, for instance, can do to better, kind of prepare people to understand, how their bills are, what factors might be, contributing to their bills being high. So I know we're pretty much at time, but again, great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. And we really appreciate your contribution to our class and to this dialogue that I know will bring more questions. And perhaps I can help channel those in the future so that we can continue this collaboration across the skies and across the internet. Again, we're gonna close now, and just to let you know, Diana, this has been a great contrast from our last presentation. Both high quality presentations, but actually are helping us to understand the complexities from the household level to the system level when you talk about energy systems and you intertwine justice and equity issues in all facets of that system. So thank you again. Big round of applause to Diana.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sticking it out. Ciao.
We'll talk soon.
Okay, definitely. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys. Thank you for everybody that shared with us today. We will see you next time.
Talia, you got so lucky.
Yeah.
Oh no! Wait up!
Had she answered my question?
No, just with your chapter.
Oh, yeah, I did. She's pretty awesome. She knows what she's talking about. Not that Clark didn't know, but she's willing to, yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
You guys just wait and see the remaining names. Bring surprises with them. You'll see. Take care, guys.
All right,
We'll
thank
see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Cecilio.
Hey, thank you.